Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in our lives when the truth we hold closest to our hearts is not the truth we share with the world. We hide things, not always out of shame, not always out of fear, but sometimes out of a deep, almost primal instinct to protect what is fragile, what is still forming, what is too precious to be exposed to the harshness of collective judgment. And today, I want to speak with you about something that has, in many ways, been misunderstood, misrepresented, and sometimes even distorted by the lenses through which people see. It is the story of a wedding, yes, but much more than that, it is the story of the human brain, of love, of memory, and of why we conceal truths even from those who expect us to live with radical transparency. When people imagine a wedding, they see a stage of perfection. Flowers carefully arranged, vows spoken with trembling voices, laughter mixing with tears. It is a ritual that has existed in almost every society, in every era, a shared performance of commitment and celebration. But beneath that ritual, beneath the music and the clinking of glasses, lies something intensely private, the neural rewiring of two lives becoming one. The truth that was hidden about this particular wedding wasn't a matter of scandal, but of science. It was the recognition that marriage is less about the spectacle and more about the invisible, profound restructuring that occurs inside the brain. Neuroscience tells us that love, commitment, and bonding are not abstract concepts. They are not merely words we inscribe on rings or vows. They are neurochemical storms. Oxytocin, dopamine, vasopressin. These are the architects of intimacy. They sculpt our decisions. They reinforce patterns of trust. They heighten our focus on one person above all others. And yet, what most people fail to understand is that when you step into marriage, you are not simply promising another human your devotion, you are altering the landscape of your own cognition. You are reshaping memory, attention, and motivation itself. Now imagine carrying the weight of billions of eyes, each expecting not just a ceremony, but a performance that will confirm or deny their deepest suspicions, their gossips, their predictions. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your personal milestone will not be seen as yours, but as theirs, a public event to be dissected, analyzed, praised, or criticized. And so, what was hidden was not an act of betrayal, but a shield to protect the sanctity of what, in biological terms, is one of the most fragile transitions a human can undergo, the binding of two nervous systems into one rhythm. I want to share with you a story, not from tabloids or press releases, but from the laboratory. Years ago, researchers at Emory University conducted an extraordinary experiment on prairie voles. Prairie voles are small, unassuming creatures, but they hold one of the secrets of monogamy. Unlike most mammals, prairie voles bond for life. When a pair mates, their brains flood with oxytocin and vasopressin, creating a neurological lock that ties them together. What is fascinating is that if you interrupt this process, if you block the receptors even for a short time, the bond never forms. They go on living as strangers. Now imagine that in the human brain, this bonding is magnitudes more complex. A wedding is not just a party. It is a moment when the brain enters a heightened state of neuroplasticity. It is recording, amplifying, and encoding patterns that will define decades. Every look exchanged, every hand held, every whispered word, it is all data being embedded into long-term circuits. If those moments are contaminated by the noise of public scrutiny, the encoding changes. The memory doesn't become one of intimacy, it becomes one of exposure. That is the hidden truth. The wedding was not about avoiding the world, but about preserving the integrity of memory. Neuroscientists call this the consolidation window. After an emotionally significant event, the brain requires a period of quiet, undisturbed integration. If you interfere, if you flood it with stress hormones from cameras, from speculation, from the anxiety of being watched, the memory that should have been warm, binding, becomes fragile, brittle. And once it is brittle, it shatters easily under the pressure of future conflict. But let's step away from the lab for a moment. Let's go to something more human. A young couple, not famous, not known to anyone outside their town, once told me that they regretted their wedding. Not because they didn't love each other, but because they spent the entire day performing for others. They didn't remember holding each other's hands. They didn't remember their vows. What they remembered was posing, worrying about the flowers, making sure the playlist didn't skip. In other words, their brains encoded stress where there should have been love. Years later, they divorced, not because of a lack of commitment, but because when conflict arose, the memory of their beginning was not strong enough to carry them through. You see, when we talk about hiding truths, we often assume deception. But neuroscience gives us a different lens. Hiding can be a form of care. Shielding information can be a way of ensuring survival. Just as the immune system shields a wound from infection by forming a scab, so too do we sometimes place coverings over our most tender moments until they have healed enough to withstand the world's contact. The irony is that in a culture obsessed with transparency, we often forget that transparency, when forced, can be corrosive. The brain thrives not on constant exposure, but on cycles of openness and protection. Think about sleep, for example. During the day, you are exposed, you absorb, you learn, you endure stress. At night, your brain closes itself off, prunes connections, consolidates memories, and heals. If we demanded transparency even from sleep, we would collapse. So why do we expect absolute exposure in human love? And yes, I know some will say, but don't we deserve to know? Isn't the world entitled to see? To that, I pose a simple question. When a neuron fires in your brain, do you demand that every neighboring cell reveal its secrets? No. The brain functions on boundaries, on selective sharing, on gated connections. If every neuron exposed itself constantly, the system would collapse into chaos. Love is no different. The truth that was hidden about this wedding was that it was not about the world. It was about the brain, about the delicate, almost imperceptible process of transforming two trajectories into one orbit. And to honor that, sometimes silence is the only honest language. But let's move deeper. Let's talk about what happens months after the ceremony, when the vows have been spoken and the music has faded. The human brain enters a phase scientists call neural synchronization. Couples who spend time together begin to show aligned brainwave patterns. Their heart rates synchronize, their cortisol levels rise and fall in tandem. This is not poetry, it is biology. But here's the catch. This synchronization is fragile at first. It requires protection, nurturing, and privacy. Think of it like the early growth of a neural stem cell in the hippocampus. If disturbed too soon, it fails to thrive. But if given the right environment, it flourishes into networks that last a lifetime. And so, to the world, what was hidden seemed like a scandal. But to the brain, what was hidden was necessary. It was the equivalent of letting a wound close, of letting a song finish before clapping. It was not about secrecy. It was about respect for the process of memory, bonding, and transformation. And perhaps the most fascinating part of this process is that the brain itself is aware when it is being watched. Studies using functional MRI have shown that when a person performs an action under observation, the brain activates regions associated not only with the task itself, but also with self-monitoring. This dual activation can degrade performance, leading to what psychologists call choking under pressure. Now imagine applying this same principle to the most intimate, transformative event of one's life. A wedding, when turned into a global broadcast, ceases to be about the bond, it becomes a performance. The brain that should be encoding love, trust, and intimacy instead encodes anxiety, judgment, and exposure. The hidden truth, then, was not that there was something to conceal, but that there was something to protect. The neurological sanctity of commitment. I want to take you further into the science of memory here, because it is critical to understanding why privacy is not indulgence, but necessity. The hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain, is responsible for encoding episodic memories. The where, the when, the who. It is exquisitely sensitive to stress hormones. When cortisol levels spike, the hippocampus literally shrinks in its ability to lay down new memories. In practical terms, that means that a wedding overshadowed by stress will not be remembered as vividly or as warmly as one protected by calm. And since those memories serve as the emotional foundation of the relationship, the entire future bond can be affected. This is not just theory, it is visible in longitudinal studies of couples. Those who describe their wedding as intimate, authentic, and emotionally centered are more likely to report marital satisfaction decades later. Those who describe it as stressful, public, or performance-driven often report a weaker emotional foundation. Why? Because their brain stored the wrong kind of memory at the wrong time. This is why the truth about this wedding had to be guarded. It was not an act of hiding from others. It was an act of ensuring that the hippocampus could do its work uncorrupted. Now, some may say, but isn't love strong enough to withstand anything? Why does it need protecting? To that I would answer, yes, love is powerful, but it is also deeply physiological. You would not expect a broken bone to heal properly if you kept reopening the wound for inspection. You would not expect a newborn child to thrive if you exposed it to constant noise and chaos. Love is no different. It requires incubation. It requires a protected space where neurochemistry can stabilize before being tested by the world. I'll give you an example from clinical practice. There was a young couple who volunteered for a study on stress and bonding. They were asked to recount their wedding day while being monitored for heart rate variability, cortisol levels, and emotional synchrony. When they described the intimate moments, walking down the aisle, whispering to each other, their heart rates aligned, their cortisol dropped, their synchrony increased. But when they described the stressful parts, the speeches, the scrutiny, the relatives judging the food, their physiological systems desynchronized. Their bond, at least in that moment, weakened. Multiply that by years of memory, and you begin to see how fragile the system is. So the truth that was hidden about this wedding was that it was not about spectacle, not about who attended, not about the grandeur of the venue. It was about the protection of memory and mind, about safeguarding the moment when two nervous systems entered into orbit around each other, about ensuring that what was encoded was love, not judgment, intimacy, not exposure. But there is another dimension, one even deeper than neurochemistry. It is the psychological principle of narrative identity. Each of us constructs a life story, a narrative we tell ourselves about who we are, where we have been, and where we are going. Weddings are one of the most significant chapters in that story. If that chapter is written not by the individuals living it, but by the audience watching it, the integrity of the narrative collapses. The story no longer belongs to the couple. It belongs to the crowd. And when the story is no longer yours, you lose the ability to anchor your identity in it. This is why so many public figures, despite wealth and adoration, struggle in their private relationships. Their stories have been hijacked. Their beginnings have been narrated by strangers. And here is where we return to the notion of truth. What was hidden was not a lie. It was an attempt to preserve authorship of the story, to ensure that when two people looked back decades later, they would not see the gaze of the world but the gaze of each other. That is not deception. That is the most profound form of honesty, because it acknowledges the limits of human resilience, the vulnerability of memory, the fragility of beginnings. Now, let's take this one step further. Neuroscientists studying long-term couples have discovered something remarkable, the phenomenon of empathic resonance. When two people share a deep bond, their brains begin to mirror each other's emotions. If one is sad, the other shows activation in regions associated with sadness. If one is joyful, the other's brain lights up in parallel. This is not metaphor, it is literal resonance. But here's the catch: for this resonance to stabilize, it needs a foundation of trust, privacy, and shared meaning. If the bond begins under the glare of performance, empathic resonance can be weaker. The couple becomes more reactive to external judgment, less attuned to each other. That was the risk. That was why the truth was hidden. And let's not forget the children. Not children born yet, but the potential future of the family. Epigenetics teaches us that the emotional environment of parents shapes the biology of their offspring. Stress hormones in one generation can alter gene expression in the next. A wedding drenched in scrutiny does not simply affect the couple. It lays the groundwork for stress patterns that ripple into the next generation. Protecting the sanctity of a beginning is not selfish. It is an investment in the health of those yet to be born. So when we ask, what was hidden, we must also ask, why was it necessary? And the answer lies in science, psychology, and humanity itself. It was necessary because love is not a performance. It is a quiet revolution inside the brain, a shift in chemistry and cognition that requires shelter, not spectacle. Perhaps then the truth is this: a wedding is not for the world. It is for the two minds, the two hearts, the two bodies that will spend the rest of their lives entangled. And when the world demands exposure, sometimes the bravest act of all is to say no. And so, the hidden truth was not an act of secrecy. It was an act of love. It was the recognition that the deepest transformations cannot survive in the open air of scrutiny. They must be incubated, like seedlings in the soil, like neurons finding new pathways, like hearts learning to beat in unison. And when years from now, the story of this wedding is told, not by cameras, not by headlines, but by the two people who lived it, then the truth will not be hidden anymore. It will be theirs, intact, uncorrupted, powerful. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a truth worth protecting. Ladies and gentlemen, when we speak of truth, it is tempting to reduce it to a binary, truth or lie, revealed or hidden, shared or withheld. But the brain does not operate in binaries. It operates in layers, in thresholds, in carefully modulated signals. A neuron does not fire all at once. It integrates thousands of inputs before it crosses a threshold. In the same way, what we call truth is not a single burst of light, but a rhythm, a gradual unfolding. Sometimes the wisest choice is not to reveal everything immediately, but to allow it to emerge when the environment is ready to receive it. This wedding was a living example of that principle. It was not a rejection of transparency, but a recognition that timing matters. Neuroscientists call this critical periods. Just as a child has a critical period to learn language, just as the brain has critical periods to acquire vision or motor skills, love too has its critical period. A wedding is that moment, and if you flood it with noise too soon, the circuitry never stabilizes. But if you guard it, protect it, allow it to consolidate, then it becomes indestructible. Let me share a personal reflection from years of studying the mind. Again and again, I've seen that people who cherish privacy in their milestones, not secrecy, but privacy, are often healthier, more resilient, and more grounded. Couples who treat their love not as a commodity to be displayed, but as a living organism to be nurtured, create bonds that last. Those who expose everything often find themselves burned out, their intimacy diluted by the constant gaze of others. And so, the truth hidden about this wedding was not scandal, not deception, not some dark detail. It was the truth of fragility, the truth of incubation, the truth of timing. It was a truth that said, before we can share this with the world, we must first let it take root in our own minds, our own memories, our own hearts. We live in an age where the world demands immediacy. Share your joy now, or it isn't real. Post your milestone, or it didn't happen. Prove your love to us, or it must not exist. But love is not for the world. It is for the two who live it. And sometimes the most radical act of authenticity is to refuse the demand for constant proof. As a neuroscientist, I can tell you that the brain does not thrive on constant exposure. It thrives on cycles of rest and activity, of openness and privacy, of connection and solitude. That rhythm is how memories form, how emotions stabilize, how love endures. And so, to shield a wedding from the world is not to deny its existence, but to honor the rhythm that makes it possible. And as a human being, I can tell you this: the most beautiful truths are not those shouted from the rooftops, but those whispered in the quiet of two hearts, beating side by side, the vows spoken not for cameras, but for each other, the laughter that no one else hears, the tears that are wiped away by a hand that will be there for a lifetime. This was the truth that was hidden, not because it was shameful, but because it was sacred. Not because it was fragile forever, but because it needed time to grow strong. And when it was strong, when it was unshakable, only then could it be shared with the world. So perhaps the lesson here is not about one wedding at all. Perhaps it is about all of us, about learning to protect what is precious, to resist the pressure of performance, to honor the invisible transformations that shape our lives, because if we cannot protect our beginnings, we cannot protect our futures. Ladies and gentlemen, life will always ask you to reveal more than you are ready to share. It will tempt you to trade intimacy for applause, depth for visibility, truth for performance. But remember the brain, the heart, the bond. All of them know the value of timing, of shelter, of privacy. They know that sometimes the truest truth is the one you hold close until it is ready to shine. So let us honor that. Let us remember that some truths are not hidden to deceive. They are hidden to endure. And one day, when the story is told, not by headlines, not by whispers, but by the lives built together, that truth will stand, untouchable, uncorrupted, and whole. Thank you.